Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever thought about when an airplane's flight actually ends? Most of us probably assume it's right when the wheels touch the tarmac, the engine winds down, and that's it. But as we're going to see today, that's really just the beginning of the end. An airplane kind of has a life of its own. It's constantly being passed from the command of one pilot to another. So today, we're diving into why a flight doesn't truly end until the aircraft is safely put to sleep, locked down against the elements, and that baton is officially handed off to the next pilot.
Okay, so let's just jump right into our checklist for today. We'll be looking at safely shutting down, positioning the airplane, the rules of refueling, securing the aircraft, and finally, post-flight documentation.
Section 1. Safely shutting down. Taming the beast. Stepping out of that cockpit comes with a massive amount of individual responsibility. You aren't just flipping a switch on a machine. You're securing a highly complex piece of engineering so the next person inherits a perfectly safe aircraft. Shutting down a plane? Yeah, it is not like turning off your car. It's this whole meticulous sequence. Ideally, you point the plane into the wind, set that parking brake, and just let the engine cool down for a minute. Then, you test the magnetos. Those are what power the spark plugs, just to make sure they're working right. After that, you turn off all the individual electrical systems, like your radios and lights, so you don't kill the battery. And then the kicker? You don't just cut the power. You actually set the mixture control to idle cutoff. Basically, you are intentionally starving the engine of fuel to force it to stop running. Now, flight school manuals mandate this very specific life-saving warning. Do not simply turn the key to shut down the engine. Sounds totally counterintuitive, right? I mean, that's how we turn off practically everything else. But in aviation, just turning the key without doing that whole fuel starvation sequence first can literally lead to absolute disaster on the tarmac. Which brings us to a pretty terrifying reality on the ground. Pilots often do what's called a dead cut check. They'll quickly flip the ignition off and back on just to make absolutely sure the circuit is actually breaking. Why go to all that trouble? Well, because if the magnetos aren't properly grounded, the circuit isn't broken. That means the engine and the propeller could still be entirely live, even if the switch is sitting right there in the off position. Crazy, right?
And this right here perfectly illustrates why you must never, ever casually handle the prop. If those magnetos aren't grounded, just an innocent accidental bump of that blade could start the engine completely out of nowhere. It creates an incredibly dangerous and potentially fatal situation. The golden rule? You have to treat every single propeller as if it's completely live and ready to fire. No exceptions.
Moving on to Section 2, positioning the airplane, moving on the ground.
Okay, so once the engine is officially dead, the ignition is off and the key is out, you're still not done. You've got to physically reposition the aircraft for parking or hangaring without wrecking it. To do this, you absolutely have to use an approved tug or tow bar. Shoving the plane around by the wrong parts can easily scratch or seriously damage it. And think about how close you have to get to that blade. Even with the engine completely off, before you get anywhere near the nose to hook up that tow bar, you better double, maybe even triple check that those switches are undoubtedly off.
Section 3. The rules of refueling. Flammable responsibilities. Now, if you thought pumping gas into your car was a mindless chore, aviation refueling is a whole different ballgame. It's a highly regulated, meticulous process. It's way more than just topping off a tank. The manual breaks it down into 3 main pillars: checking the exact quantity of fuel added, verifying the quality of that fuel, and, this is a big one, minimizing the massive risk of fire. Literally every precaution supports these 3 things. For instance, obviously, no smoking. But get this, no radio transmissions are allowed either, because those radio waves can actually create static sparks. You also have to leave the parking brake off while refueling. Why? Well, so if a fire does break out, the airplane can be immediately shoved away from the fuel truck. And before you take a single drop, you're checking the fuel's exact color to verify its octane rating. Because of this huge fire risk, you absolutely have to ground the airplane to the fuel truck or the pump, and then ground the nozzle to the airplane before you even think about opening those fuel caps. See, fuel rushing through a hose generates a ton of static electricity. If you don't have that grounding wire hooked up, a catastrophic static spark could ignite the fumes the literal second you crack the tank open. It's serious business. On top of that, you can't just trust what the gauges tell you. You have to physically dip the tanks to check the real quantity. And crucially, you have to physically drain little samples from all the tanks and the strainer. You're basically looking for water and dirt. If it's been raining or even just if condensation has built up overnight, water can sink right down to the bottom of the fuel tank. And here's the thing, water doesn't burn. If a slug of water hits the engine while you're flying, the engine stops. Period. End of story.
All right, Section 4, securing the aircraft, battling the elements. So the plane is fueled and parked, but we have to remember something fundamental here. Airplanes are literally designed to be picked up by the wind. So an unattended airplane just sitting out on the tarmac is incredibly vulnerable to the weather. It has to be physically locked down and basically battle-readied against the elements. It's a two-part job. Inside, you've got to lock the control wheels. If you skip this, a strong gust of wind can violently slam the elevators and ailerons around outside, which can actually snap the control cables right inside the plane. Then, on the outside, you put the pitot covers on, got to keep bugs and rainwater out of those airspeed sensors, and strap a heavy cover over the cockpit to protect all those sensitive, expensive avionics from baking in the sun or getting soaked in a storm. Next, we have to look at how the plane is physically attached to the ground. The aircraft needs to be parked facing directly into the wind because, well, that's its most aerodynamic, stable profile. You chock the wheels so it can't roll away, but honestly, gravity just isn't enough here. You have to use heavy tie-down ropes attached to the wings and the tail, anchoring the whole thing directly into the tarmac. This keeps a sudden thunderstorm from generating lift and completely flipping the plane over, or violently throwing the tail around. And finally, Section 5, post-flight documentation, the final handoff. The physical labor, the towing, the fueling, the tying down, that might all be finished, but the baton hasn't officially been passed yet. A flight does not end until the bureaucratic but absolutely vital paperwork is signed off. You have to document everything meticulously. You record the engine time, which is often called the Hobbs time, straight into the aircraft's log. This tracks exactly when the plane needs its mandatory maintenance overhauls. And crucially, if there were any defects with the airplane during the flight, pilots call these squawks, you have to report them. Writing down these squawks in the maintenance log ensures the mechanic steps in right away. That way, you're guaranteeing the next pilot gets a perfectly serviceable, totally safe airplane. And then finally, you fill out your own personal logbook. Ultimately, the big takeaway from this explainer is that aviation safety is this continuous, unbreakable chain. It relies entirely on the meticulous responsibility of every single pilot, not just to fly the plane well, but to leave it in a state of absolute readiness for the next person. The flight truly ends when the paperwork is signed, the keys are handed over, and the airplane is safely asleep. As we wrap things up today, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question, one that comes straight from the flight manual's final review. When you tie the airplane down, how tight should the rope tension actually be? Really think about the brutal physical reality of wind yanking on a parked plane overnight. Think about the tension, the sheer strain on that metal. What happens to the wing's internal structure if you crank that rope down just a little too tight? Or, on the flip side, what kind of disaster might happen if you leave it just slightly too loose? Keep that tension in mind next time you see a small plane resting out on the tarmac. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.